The Naturalization Act of 1965.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill. It does not affect the lives of millions. It will not reshape the structure of our daily lives or really add importantly to either our wealth or our power.
This statement presented by President Johnson could not have been farther from the truth, as the act is still vital in the U.S. today. By the mid-1900s, United States immigration rates were the lowest they had been in 70 years due to quotas restricting certain nationalities from entering the country, especially during times of war. The quotas targeted specific populations and were popular with some Americans, but others were not as keen. Industrialization was on the rise in the 1930s through 50s, and skilled immigrants who accepted low wages were necessary for the nation's manufacturing industry to flourish. Immigrants were needed in America, and as a compromise for years of discrimination and for the conflict caused, the Naturalization Act of 1965 was put in place. This important piece of legislation removed previous quotas based on nationalities, although it was not meant to be a revolutionary bill.
It all started in the early 1800s when the United States won independence from Great Britain, and people, mainly from Europe, started immigrating into the United States in bigger amounts for freedom of religion and other opportunities. Later, around 1815, there was a span of 5 million immigrants that came to the U.S. seeking economic opportunities. In that time period, the United States was in the Civil War, where no immigrants were allowed into the country. When the war ended, the immigration ban was lifted. It allowed a lot of people into the U.S.
In 1850, the gold rush began, and the first Asian immigrants entered the U.S. This happened because Asians wanted to increase their money potential, since most of Asia was in poverty due to harsh ruling of the British. During the gold rush, California workers were upset at Chinese immigrants who were causing the wages to lower. This rush of immigrants also increased the diversity within the U.S. population, as a large percentage of the newcomers were Asian. As you can see in this pie chart, the red percentage represents the Asian population, and over the course of 20 years during the gold rush, the red increases in size.
In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was put in place to limit the amount of Chinese laborers allowed into the United States. This was the first major act that limited a specific nationality. As you can see in this political cartoon, the U.S. was meant to be a free country that treats all equally, but on the other hand, it's restricting a specific nationality from entering the country. As Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, said, "We came to America, either ourselves or in the persons of our ancestors, to better the ideals of men, to make them see finer things than they had seen before, to get rid of the things that divide, and make sure of the things that unite." As Wilson said, America wants to get rid of the things that divide them, but the Chinese Exclusion Act divided them even further, and was the first sign that change needed to happen in the future.
Although some Chinese immigrants weren't allowed into the United States, immigrants from Europe continued to increase, and it started to add up very quickly. From 1870 to 1900, there were 12 million immigrants total, from mainly Germany, Ireland, and England. As you can see in the chart, those three countries make up more than half of the immigrants entering the United States. That was the beginning of how immigration became the center of our economy, and Europe was becoming the territory's main immigration provider as the Chinese immigrants were being cut off.
In 1890, the industrialization period began, and cultural tensions started to rise as there were new competition for job opportunities. For instance, Mr. Malia, my grandfather, immigrated from Malta, and as he explains,
Man, looking for a job. I think I had a job the next day I was here. I was just went to an agent, and they sent me someplace for a job, and I had a job the next day.
showing that industry was on the rise.
After being at an immigration all-time high, the economy was hit with a depression in 1890 due to the rise of industrialization, and companies were making more product than they were selling. Because of that, they were losing money and dropping employees to save money, and the immigration status was at a 3.7 million low. It then jumped up again to an 8.8 million high due to the Depression being over, making 1907 a peak year of admission for new immigrants. Immigration rates were always jumping around in the 1800s until we got more into the early 1900s and it seemed to drop off.
In 1920, the immigration rates dropped off by a lot again because of the World War from 1914 to 1918. When the war was over, immigration rates didn't get any better. The immigration rules were still tightened, and early in 1917 there was a Literacy Act put in place requiring immigrants to take a test to be admitted into the country. This made entering the U.S. harder for certain parts of Asia, Africa, and part of Europe, and easier for West Europeans. In addition, the Naturalization Act of 1924 only allowed 2% of every nationality from getting a visa, putting yet another restriction on immigrants based on nationality. This favored West Europe and limits Asia and Latin American countries' immigrants.
Up until 1945, that marked the end of World War II, the immigration rates were consistently low, but they got 1.3 million immigrants lower when the war ended. The United States needed to change this because overall the immigrant amount was the lowest in 70 years. Here's a summary of the past years leading up to the act. In 1850, immigration rates began to increase due to the gold rush. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act caused a decrease. In 1890, statistics increased dramatically as the industrial period began. Suddenly, the economy was hit with a depression in the early 1900s, so rates plummeted. The world wars continued to decrease rates.
And because of this extreme drop, the Congress needed to come up with a compromise, and with that, the Immigration Act of 1965 started to come together. When the act was being made, it wasn't necessarily intended to change immigration completely, for the fact that the citizens of the United States weren't comfortable with outsiders, and they were afraid newcomers would take over the economy like the Chinese did in 1850.
President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the act on October 3, 1965, at the foot of the Statue of Liberty. This act was a new start for immigration, and it removed any nationality quotas that were restricting certain nationalities.
The bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill. It does not affect the lives of millions. It will not reshape the structure of our daily lives or really add importantly to either our wealth or our power.
He was wrong. This act still affects immigration to this day. For example, U.S. immigration rates have continued to increase since the act was put in place. This affected not only the U.S., but it impacted nations all over the world, as it reunited families and provided opportunities to foreigners in need of a better life after a brutal world war.
Overall, the act made a huge impact on the U.S. economy and the United States citizens' everyday life. Also, as the President stated, the act corrects a cruel and enduring wrong in the conduct of the American nation. This means that it makes the country more open.
Just 15 years after the act was made, the Asian immigrant rates were 4 times what they were before the act was made. In 1950, there were 50% Europeans and 6% Asian immigrants. Just 40 years after that, in 1990, the percentages were at 17% Europeans and 33% Asian immigrants.
Overall, the act made a huge, unexpected impact on the U.S. economy for 60 years to come. The only time it has been tampered with was when President Trump placed restrictions on certain nationalities, as Calvin Coolidge has done previously in 1924. Although at this point in time it seems as if we are reverting in the United States' old ways, in the years leading up to Donald Trump's presidency, this act was in full effect, and the 1965 act could be foreshadowing what could potentially happen in the future once again.
In conclusion, during the early 1800s, the United States was just getting out of the Revolutionary War, and for immigrants mainly in Europe, America was the place to go for opportunities and prosperity. Over the course of an entire century, immigration rates had ups and downs, but finally in 1965, a major change occurred that would affect the country for many more years to come, still and counting. Overall, this act was in fact revolutionary, contrary to President Johnson's statement, because the demographic makeup was changed and the U.S. was one step closer to becoming the open country it calls itself.